we could have the best asset in the best location, which sounds great, but if the asking price for that, or the price we can get it for, is not relative to what we think we can rent it for, then we're not going to enter that market. So I think that there are a lot of markets on the Jersey Shore that have great, they're within 2 hours of New York or Philadelphia. There are houses right on the ocean, right on the beach, the boardwalk, whatever. They have amazing amenities, but they're selling for $5 million. And even on in a fantastic year, we couldn't approach anything approaching a number that would justify that as an investment. And I think part of it, frankly, is colored by the performance of our existing assets. Because for us, the calculation is more, there's an opportunity cost to devoting money towards one place versus another. So if we're looking at Atlantic City and we're thinking, well, we can make whatever return on our cash, our own cash or investor cash in Atlantic City, and we look somewhere else and we think, well, we can make half of that or a third of that or a tenth of that, why would we ever bother with that other market? We should just go to Atlantic City. Now, there are other reasons why we might want to enter those other markets. It could be that we want to just diversify our assets. It could be that we want to build an infrastructure in that market and we think that we can kind of achieve economies of scale, reducing expenses and maybe driving up revenue if we can by entering the market. But as a general statement, I think, given that we know how to operate in one market in a large way, using that as a benchmark to compare pricing in another market is helpful. I wouldn't say that, at least not in my mind, that's not the only driver. I think all these other things that you just talked about, Ryan, are very important, but I think that's high up there. If we can't get an asset that we think is reasonably priced, it doesn't matter how much demand, the great location, the amenities, it's kind of the brass tacks of the numbers, right?
Yeah, well, this isn't something that we've ever talked about, but I think something that is worth considering for the two of us is obviously the vast majority of our portfolio now is in Atlantic City, and it's obviously a very seasonal market. I could see some value to taking the approach of what would be a nice complement to a summer seasonal heavy portfolio, maybe something that's a little bit more winter focused or a little bit more, that's something that sustains a little bit more year round demand. So that alone might be enough reason for us to say, hey, like we know we can get a 10% return on any given asset in Atlantic City. We might only be at 8 or 9 in one of these other markets, but if the distribution of that 8 or 9% is weighted more heavily toward the winter or more heavily towards spring and fall, as opposed to being so concentrated in the summer, then just from a lifestyle perspective and kind of a stability of cash flows perspective from a business standpoint, there's a lot of value to that too.
I feel like there's a way this conversation goes where we say everything we've just said, and then we have an episode in a couple months or whatever where it's like an update on this conversation. It's like, yep, we're doing senior living, short-term rentals in Western Texas. It's great. Amazing market. No, but yeah, I think that's a great point. I think having that opposite seasonality would be interesting. So I think another extension of that, which we alluded to just now, is, for us, that cost is not a dollar conversation alone. It's also a conversation about our time and our effort. So, is it worth it for us to operate a single STR somewhere that is completely opposite of where our current STRs are, even if it makes great returns, even if it has, great numbers and, meets all the check boxes? Is it really worth it for us? Because now we have to kind of build an infrastructure in that one area. And I think if all those things are great, I could imagine Roe would say, okay, great. Well, we'll start with one, but the expectation is that we want to get 10 or 20. But I don't think that we're at a point right now where it would be okay for us to say we're going to get one and that's it. We don't have any plans to do anymore. It's just not worth our time, even if it's a great return on money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I echo that 100%. I think I have 4 different variables to consider that I wanted to add to this conversation because I think it's relevant to the decision-making process, both for us and any other investors looking at new short-term rental markets. The first one I had written down was scale, which you just touched on. Second one was distance, which you talked about. How far is it from our home base? Mm-hmm. The third I have is accessibility, which ties into distance a little bit, but we've only really discussed short-term rental markets in the context of things within like 2.5 to 3 hours at most and that's driving distance from northern New Jersey, New York City. But I think another potential draw is if we were to expand outside of this immediate geographic area and look somewhere that's a flight away. There's a big difference between a place that is remote and an hour and a half drive from the nearest airport, because a quick trip there suddenly goes from being a 1.5 hour flight and 15-minute drive to a 1 hour flight, 1.5 hour flight, and an hour and a half drive each way to and from the airport. Mm-hmm. So I know people who maybe not short-term rentals as much, but I know a lot of people who have purchased investment properties in specific cities because it was something as simple as there being a lot of very easy, readily available direct flights from an airport in the New York City area to whatever their destination market
was. That's a great point.
And if you're trying to pair your STR investment with some personal use, then that's even more valuable, because if you're trying to take your family down there or go there alone with friends, significant other, you're obviously going to be much more inclined to use it if it's easy to get to.
I think that kind of dovetails as well with the location versus asset demand. If you're looking at a place that's really inaccessible, it's probably not the location that's the draw, because if the location was the draw, it'd probably be more accessible. As in, they probably would have built, at some point, infrastructure would have been built to accommodate the ability of people to get there. I don't think that's always true, but I
think there's a lot of like national park type stuff, like stuff in Maine, near Acadia, or like in the Great Smoky Mountains, or I think there are certainly exceptions to that. I think a lot of ski towns are also.
Yeah. I'm thinking like Jackson Hole. It's an airport. Like there are ways to get into these places. Like I agree. Like if you want to go to. Yeah, a national park. I mean, they're not like airports in national parks. I would say there are airports near national parks. I mean, Acadia is like, I guess you'd fly into somewhere in Maine. I don't know, Boston, I guess, but it's pretty inaccessible.
Yeah, I think my point is like I think people make. I'm certainly not the person to ask about this because I don't really ski and I've never skied or snowboarded out west. But I know there's a plethora of mountains in Colorado, for example, that have great skiing. But I think oftentimes people go to one mountain in particular or a series of mountains. Because of their proximity to Denver Airport or Vail or wherever you would fly into, as opposed to a mountain that is equal or even superior skiing, but is an additional 2-hour drive.
Yeah, agreed.
Don't forget to visit us at brickxbrickrealestate.com for free content to help you along your real estate journey and to follow along on our projects. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. And engage with us online via Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and brickxbrickrealestate.com. See you next time on the Brick by Brick Podcast.